Hey, folks, and welcome back. We are going to continue working on this first form. But instead of working on questions quite yet, we're going to change some of the settings so that we can make those just like we want for your audience and what you're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and click over here to settings. Now, one of the things that I have done here is the first thing I did, and since this is Google Forms for assessment, is I want to make this a quiz. So I'll click right here and change that to a quiz. What that does is it's going to create for each of the questions that you put in, it's going to have a point value, and it's also going to require an answer key. And it may change the way that you decide to frame your questions or structure your questions, since you will probably want this to be able to grade itself. You don't have to do that. You can go through and assign point values for some of the questions, but at the end of the day, what the most efficient method and what makes Google Forms so useful for assessments is being able to have it self-grade. So I'm just going to cover some of these settings, and you'll be able to make the decisions of how you want to set those. So first of all, this release grades. You can have Google Forms release the grade right after each submission. So that will mean that students get or respondents get their results right after they finish the assessment, which is really great for feedback. But in some cases, it can be a little bit difficult because you may not want those uh, results to be shared from class to class. Talk a little more about that in a minute. In some cases, you may have long answer questions that might require some manual review. So you might want to switch on later after manual review so that you can actually grade some of the responses that are longer. Um, Missed questions, students can see which ones they didn't answer correctly. It doesn't give them the correct answer, it just shows them which ones they missed. And then correct answers, it will in fact show them the correct answer on problems that they missed. So this is really useful again for feedback and that one more form of learning. But it can also be really dangerous for other classes that might be taking the same quiz. Point values, they can see the points that they've received for each one of the questions. And down here is default question point value. Default, some people don't know what that word means. And it's basically, if I haven't set it to something else, then that's the value that should be in there. So each time I have a new question, it will default to 2 points. So if I don't set it to something else, it will be 2 points. And I have already set that value. You can move it up and down. Okay, now for responses, you have a few things that you may want to consider. So one of those is collecting email addresses. And some of the other things rely on collecting email addresses. It also makes it so that your form is not anonymous. And that means that somebody would have to sign in to their Google account in order to have it collect the email address. I think that's a good move in most cases. So I turn that on. You then have the option of them being able to see a copy of their response or have a copy of their response to the form. You can turn that on or off or when it's requested. You can allow the students to edit their response after they've already submitted it. If maybe it's something you're continuously working on and they can adjust as they work. That's an option that you can turn on, that they can go back in and adjust their response. And you can also limit to a single response. That's also going to be related to a couple of other things that show up here in just a moment. So if you want them to only respond one time, it's going to require that they sign in, and that will make it so that they only have one response. And in most cases for a quiz, you probably want a single response. Now, here is how the form is presented. The quiz is presented. Sometimes if you have a longer form, you may want to have a progress bar so they see how far along they are. Shuffling the question order can be really great if you're in the middle of classroom and there are kids sitting close by, you maybe don't want them to be looking at the same questions at the same time. So that it just complicates dishonesty with kids in class. Confirmation message to make sure that a student realizes that yes, they have definitely responded and it's been recorded. You can edit that message. Um, Show link to submit another response. If you have limit to one response, then this is not really useful. But if you want them to be able to respond more than once, then you would want to turn that off and add that on. View results summary. Sometimes you may want responders to be able to see a summary of the results as they go, and that would be something you could turn on here. And finally, disable autosave. Now, this I tend not to plug in or turn on, because if somebody has a browser that's closed or something like that in the middle of their form being filled out, then they would have to start again from the beginning, and that's not a positive deal. So it will autosave for those respondents when they are working on it. So we finally have a couple of things here, and they're very short. The form defaults collect email addresses by default. So you can say, I normally want my forms to do that. And then question defaults, you can make questions required by default, because you have the option of making your questions required or not required. But I would think that as it's a quiz, that you would most often want those questions to be required as you create them. So that is the basics of the settings for your form. And we're going to move on and start looking at some of the questions that you may want to add to your form.